let's start. Welcome, Dorothée Baumann-Pauly. I'm really glad that you've taken the time to talk with me today a little bit about business and human rights, particularly in the current war situation since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. I'm Elke Schüßler. I'm head of the Institute of Organization Science at Johannes Kepler University Linz, and Dorothée Baumann-Pauly is a business and human rights expert. She's the director of the Geneva Center of Business and Human Rights at the Geneva School of Economics and Management, and also affiliated with the NYU Stern School of Business, where she has worked on human rights issues since many years. And we want to talk a little bit today with you, Doro, about your current observations and experiences. I know you've been approached by a lot of companies who are trying to make the right decision in the current war situation. And can you tell us a little bit what these companies are struggling with? What are their questions?
Thanks, Elke. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest. I look forward to our conversation because this is such a timely and important topic. And indeed, companies, some of them feel a bit lost in how to now navigate this new geopolitical landscape. And in particular, around the question whether or not they should continue doing business with Russia, who in this specific situation is the aggressor and has started a war in Ukraine, which has prompted the international community to stand in remarkable unity and sanction Russia for starting this war. And my very clear position is that the private sector needs to match this unity on the government side by also suspending business in Russia. I've been cited in multiple media articles saying exactly that, but of course in a media interview, there's never enough space to unpack the reasons. So maybe I'll go through the compounding reasons for my position today. So first of all, my field is business and human rights. And this field gained momentum through the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles in 2011. And in those principles, there is one pillar that asks companies to respect human rights. They have a responsibility to respect human rights. And the core concept here is human rights due diligence. And so, of course, in the context of the war of Ukraine, my colleagues all ask, what does human rights due diligence actually mean in such a context of war? And interestingly, the UN Guiding Principles do not mention war, mention conflict, and they mention conflict only in relation to the government's duty to protect human rights, but it's not really explained what the expectations are for companies in such a situation. So, of course, these are guiding principles, they're very high level, and they now need to be translated to very specific contexts, including situations of crisis. And the UN working group that is now working on interpreting and implementing the UN guiding principles or supporting the implementation of the guiding principles is currently in the process of developing further guidance for such specific situations. And at our center here in Geneva, we are currently working with the ICRC and DCAF on a toolkit for companies that operate in so-called complex environments. So it is certainly on the radar of the business human rights community to understand what does human rights due diligence mean, but we're nowhere near clarity. To me, the concept of complicity is indicative in that I can see a systematic approach of companies going through the ways how they could be complicit with a repressive regime. And to me, in my head, I always see concentric circles around direct complicity. And I would certainly start with companies that produce warfare, any weapons that currently go to Russia. This is the first thing that needs to cut. It directly enables a war. In a second concentric circle, I would look at companies that have so-called auxiliary industries. For example, Pirelli, they produce tires. that those tires may be put on trucks and those trucks transport weapons to Ukraine. Same with rail services, etc. And so companies need to think through how their products and services could be used for the war, and particularly for technology. This is relevant because there's often dual use technology with surveillance that could be used against citizens in Ukraine, for example. So in another important concentric circle, I see companies that pay taxes in Russia and that have large monetary flows into Russia, which of course helps the regime to keep this war alive. And clearly on the forefront are energy companies, oil, gas companies, but also commodity trading companies that need to critically assess how to unravel the oftentimes long-term contracts they have to eventually suspend and make a principled decision to suspend. And then there are, of course, many companies that only indirectly influence or are linked to Russian government. For example, food companies. And here I would make a distinction, or food or pharmaceutical companies. I would make a distinction in that I think they also, if they pay taxes, they also contribute to a regime that is currently acting in such a crossway against our values, so that that they cannot continue doing business as usual, but they can, in a more differentiated way, go through their product range, for example, and discuss, hopefully with a broader range of stakeholders, which product and services are still essential for humanitarian reasons. And I can see, products that should stay and should continue to be provided to Russian citizens, including essential medicines, also essential food items such as baby food or bottled water, if you wish, and for tech companies, software updates for hospitals, I think, could be considered an essential service. So there are exceptions, but overall, they also should make clear we do not continue with business as usual. Because again, there are compounding reasons, and as governments now so clearly condemn the war in Ukraine and also do what they can, arguably they could do more, to pressure the regime with sanctions, the private sector needs to follow suit and send a clear signal that what's happening right now is unacceptable. And of course, there's also a symbolic component to this. You have a company like McDonald's closes 800 restaurants in Russia, and that involves 62,000 employees, then it sends a strong signal to Russian citizens that something is not as it should be.
Wrong.
Indeed. And so, of course, those companies still need to find ways to communicate the reasons for their suspension to their direct business partners. And to me, this is critical because I'm fearing that with the incredibly effective censorship in Russia, this move might also be misinterpreted. And so I see a responsibility of businesses to also communicate directly with their business partners bilaterally and explain this is not against Russia generally. It's to send a strong signal that this war in Ukraine needs to end. And so to me, the suspension needs to be coupled with a communication strategy to also help the correct interpretation of this move. From an economic perspective, I see additional reasons to stop doing business with Russia right now. First off, logistical reasons, because you can't pay the suppliers easily anymore. There's no SWIFT, there's sanctions and Visa cards, and the cards are no longer working. So it's a question of how do you actually pay. But more importantly to me is the question, how can we come back to security architecture in Europe again that provides peace and stability, two conditions: which are so foundational for successful business, that prioritizing supporting peace and stability now will pay off for companies later. So I believe companies that want to be successful long term are now taking the losses accepting losses in Russia, and in so doing support an international community and a growing number of companies that are suspending businesses to pressure a regime into ending this war, which will then also lead to, I think, peace and stability in Europe again, in which business can rebuild, and also hopefully come back to Russia at some point. So these were many.
Okay. Wow. Yes, you said a lot of really interesting things now that I would like to follow up on. So, I mean, first of all, thank you for explaining very clearly why it's so difficult for companies. First of all, because there are actually no guiding principles which they can orient themselves on, their decisions on, and also, of course, because of the inherent complexities. You mentioned the multiple layers of responsibility and complicity, which companies need to figure out along their supply chains and different product lines, which are themselves often complex, and also the complexity of then disentangling this line between what is necessary still for humanitarian aid and so on. So I think that makes it quite tangible and easy to understand why it's actually not such a straightforward decision. I guess the decision that companies should do something is straightforward, but what exactly to do is much less straightforward. So
hang on, I need to jump in here, because to me it is straightforward. There's so many reasons, one on top of each other, that to me it's the easiest case. You know, we have many conflict regions around the world and many complex environments, but this to me is actually the most clear-cut case. In that there are so many layers of reasons, and operating in Russia right now without complicity is basically impossible. I just made exceptions for essential goods, and I wish companies would provide greater transparency over how they define essential, because currently these decisions are made and just internally without any insights from broader stakeholders. And what the UN guiding principles do require in the context of human rights due diligence is show and tell how you assessed risks and how you remediated those risks. And currently you have zero transparency over how these decisions are being made. And I do find it remarkable that large companies have now put out 2, sometimes 3 corporate statements about how they will deal with Russia. Every time a slight course correction, and that doesn't look good. So instead, I think they could have opened up a discourse. In our work, we've called this urgent action, human rights due diligence. If there are disruptions due to a pandemic or because a war breaks out, companies need to have the networks and the flexibility to reach out and say, these are our thoughts. Can we discuss these? And that I don't think has happened
yet. No, that's another thing.
Confidential conversations.
No, that's another thing I wanted to ask, because you mentioned unity, and I mean you've studied multi-stakeholder processes, and I've also studied them. That's how we know each other, and we know how long they take to come to an agreement. So adapting the principles to create unitary principles that all companies can guide their actions or base their actions and decisions on. It's going to take a long time, but urgent action is needed now, right? We need speed. So what would be your ideas? How can companies reach unity quickly?
So first of all, company by company, I think companies should be prepared to pull together key stakeholders within 24 hours. And I also think they could, for example, if you're a food company and you produce 2,000 products, you would put out a table of those 2,000 products, and on each line, have an explanation for why this product stays and another product is being discontinued. And the rationale for it, because I think there are, for certain goods and services, I think you can have strong reasons why they should stay. So, but you need to explain. To me, the question is, what about transparency and explaining and opening up a discourse over, is this the right thing to do? Unity among companies, I see a much stronger role should be played by industry associations. And I haven't seen them vocal at all in this space. To me, that would be the logical place, but I think internally their membership is too heterogeneous. And right now, there's still many companies that are trying to tweak sanctions and regulations and extending time horizons. They're not as bold as the government side has been.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Another thing I wanted to follow up on is that you mentioned the economic side, right? Sort of the business of peace argument. And arguably we would say, yes, our wealth depends, of our economies depends on a stable, democratic, a peaceful world order to a large part, because and that's another topic you studied, right? I mean, some companies, some industries, some supply chains do also profit from war and conflict. And I'm not talking now about the obvious, like arms industries, which we also have, and we probably have to talk about them at some point. But I'm talking more about mobile phone production, electronics production, which relies on conflict minerals and has always relied on them. And I know you've studied conflict minerals and you've also been at the production sites. Can you tell us a little bit about that other side? So the business of war, so to speak, and conflict, and business in armed conflict.
Yes, so indeed, I've done research on cobalt specifically, which is a critical battery mineral that prevents batteries from overheating. And as we're now urgently moving to electric mobility for climate change reasons, those batteries are in need more than ever. Also, governments now require the phase out of combustion engines. So there are huge incentives for car manufacturers, for example, to produce electric vehicles. And they need those batteries that contain actually huge amounts of cobalt. So in our cell phones, we have smaller quantities in the lithium-ion batteries of cobalt, but in the electric vehicles, on average, between 6 and 9 kilograms of cobalt. So the huge amounts. And interestingly, this critical battery mineral comes from a country that is best known indeed for conflict, also poverty and corruption, and it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and 2/3 of the world's cobalt production happens in the Congo. So it's a particularly challenging business context to figure out. Cobalt, however, is not a conflict mineral. So it's not defined as such, and it also doesn't come from conflict regions. It's not from the north, it's from the south of the country, from the so-called Katanga region. It's the copper and cobalt belt of the world. And that's probably the most stable and peaceful part of the country. Nevertheless, the operating context is, of course, challenging, and it will take a range of stakeholders to address the main challenges there. The two key, most egregious human rights risks in this context are mine safety issues, because particularly artisanal miners, there are fatal accidents on a daily basis, and the artisanal mining portion in the cobalt context makes about 20% of the world's production. So it's not just a small side note to that industry, it's really massive. There are so many artisanal miners digging for cobalt, and they dig tunnels with their bare hands or basic tools. Sometimes those tunnels are up to 90 meters deep, and they collapse and bury people alive. And so mine safety is one big concern. The other concern is child labor. With a very weak educational system and poverty levels so high that even very small school fees families don't manage to pay that for all their children. So some children support the extraction, others just accompany their parents to the site. And so major human rights challenges and with systemic root causes in this complex environment. So it'll take a range of stakeholders to address those issues in a sustainable way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so overall, I guess that's what I'm hearing maybe is that businesses are more a stronger force for peace than they are a force for war. So that's the positive side. If they're pressured enough, right, by different stakeholders to actually do the right thing. And you've also done a lot of thinking about stakeholders and shared responsibility. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about that? You also mentioned the stakeholders now. Who are the key stakeholders companies should get on the table with right now to talk through their decisions regarding Russia?
Oh, back to Russia. So to me, overall, I do believe businesses can be a force for good and can also stabilize societies. For the Congo, certainly, I believe that the interest of large companies could support development in the DRC in a way that is safe and sustainable in the context of mining. And I see a great responsibility for large electronic manufacturers or car manufacturers to engage. So instead of engineering cobalt out of the battery, they should actually figure out a joint remediation strategy. And in this context, I would love to see stakeholders at the table that also have very clear technical expertise. I'm not a mining engineer, but we need to know under what conditions are tunnels safe. What does ventilation need to look like? And to me, this is translating a very generic commitment to human rights responsibility into a concrete context that then also lands at very technical standards that are measurable. I'd like to know, how deep can a tunnel be to be safe? What kind of timber roof structure does it require to not collapse? And I'd like to have standards that I can measure and that companies can audit so that they can show and tell. We've done our human rights due diligence in this context, and enable a large portion of the Congolese population to actually have jobs, because just doing industrial mining doesn't provide the job, the development opportunities. So accepting artisanal mining as a business reality in the Congo is step one to accept responsibility in the mining sector there. Back to Ukraine, which stakeholders should be at the table? To me, it depends company on company, it depends a bit on the sector. But as I said before, I think business associations have a role to play, certainly civil society organizations. So I would hope if you do business in Russia, you have established contacts to the local civil society as well, although that is a very narrow space in Russia right now, to understand their needs and understand their perspective. And of course, these relationships can't be built within 24 hours. So you need to have them in place prior to any crisis breaking out. And that is true for companies operating in all geographies. Ideally, these structures for robust stakeholder relationships that you can rely on in case something happens, that is really key. And it's a skill, I think, that not many companies have often inside their organizations, this relationship building skill with external stakeholders. For a long time, companies were just very scared to even reach out to potentially critical friends. And that is something that we now see urgently needs to change. It's a business success factor to understand context, to understand stakeholder perspectives, because that then also allows for agility in case something goes wrong. And I'm not just thinking of, the extreme situations of conflict and war, but we also saw that in the context of the pandemic. How can we ensure supply chain resilience if there is such a major disruption? Well, it works best if you have those contacts and relationships in place versus a supply chain management model that is purely transactional, where you send orders and then that's the only interaction you have with the supplier. But if you actually have a relationship, you can figure out how to maintain business and supply in a way that's safe, and you solve problems together. I hope we move towards a model of a relationship-based supply chain management.
Yeah, I mean, one would think that companies would already do that. No, you talked about the Congo, the auditing standards for how tunnels would be built. One would think and expect that companies should already be doing that. But we know from industrial disasters that keep happening and so on, that the auditing procedures in place are not to assessing human rights issues properly. And the same, I guess, would apply to the Russia or Ukraine situation. You would think that that would have been a risk already monitored for, but we see that it's not very systematically. So what are your hopes for human rights, the due diligence legislations in really improving the situation, or do you see other pathways towards better due diligence on these issues?
Yes, so I mean, we've now had the UN Guiding Principles for 10 years, and it's really impressive how quickly these guiding principles have translated into legislation in Europe. We now have a German supply chain law. We have several other legislations in Europe, and at the European level, we're currently discussing, and we're really close to finalizing the requirement to conduct so-called mandatory human rights due diligence. So every company needs to show and tell how they conduct adequate human rights due diligence in their sector. And to me, this is, a really strong signal. Yet it doesn't absolve us from actually defining what does it mean industry by industry in terms of true standards that are measurable. So the implementation question to me is still wide open. And this is where I see a role for business schools to support companies in advancing human rights in corporate practice. So I think there's now great consensus and even the attempt to set a level playing field on a principled level, but the implementation still needs a lot of support, and that we see in the context of Cobalt or our work in the global garment supply chain. It's the implementation where things still break down or companies are lost in how to address it. And to me, we're at a good point. It's a positive trajectory. Laws are not a silver bullet to me, but they certainly, waving a legal stick does get everyone to the table, gets enough attention to now hopefully work in very concrete terms on the implementation question. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that gave us a really good overview of where we stand on business and human rights, how we can think about the institutions already in place in relation to the current war situation, but there's also a clear need to expand those institutions, whether it's hard or soft mechanisms to more systematically take war and armed conflict into account and develop some guiding principles for companies to be able to do the right thing and quickly.
And if I may, we have, as I said, we have many, repressive regimes around the world, and we cannot conclude we can't do business with any of them. So we need a differentiated approach, of course. I mean, democracies are the minority, so we need to accept this, the world as it is, and we need to find ways to come up with a principled business approach that also engages repressive regimes and hopefully nudges them into a direction of democratization and greater freedoms and rights for citizens and workers and communities. But an isolation strategy, as we currently have with Russia, is really an exceptional situation. That's why I argued Russia is easy. a lot more difficult is the question how to do principled business with China, for example. So
in the long term.
But that is for our next conversation.
That's for the next talk. Well, thank you so much. We will leave it at that for this short talk. Do check out the webpage of Dorothee's Institute of the Center of Business and Human Rights. They have a lot of really great reports, case studies, interesting materials. That is very, very helpful for students as well as for practitioners and companies. And thank you so much, Doro, for being with us and taking the time.
Thank you, Elke.